Welcome back to Guardrails. First of all, I want to say congratulations. You've made it, and this is our last week. But rather than using this week for your group to cross the finish line, why not consider crossing the starting line instead? If you've enjoyed your time together over these 6 weeks of study, we encourage you to continue meeting as a group. Well, that is, if you like one another. If you've been blessed by participating in this group, then we'd love to see your group continue. Now, I know that some of you are thinking, isn't this kind of a bait and switch? We signed up for a 6-week study, and now you're asking us to continue? If your group is unable to continue, we certainly understand, and we want to thank you for completing the study. But if any or all of you are interested in continuing on, we want to encourage you in that. Maybe your group host can't continue, but there's no reason why your group can't continue meeting. Who would be willing to host the next meeting? Who can lead the discussion? Who would like to keep this group growing and become the group host? We'd love to have you continue meeting, even if not everyone in your group does so. In this final session, Willie talks about the guardrails of guarding your heart. Enjoy the final session.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our last session as we conclude our series on guardrails. I hope that you've enjoyed this series. We've been learning that the purpose of guardrails is that they direct us and protect us. For the purpose of this series, we defined a guardrail as a standard of personal behavior that becomes a matter of conscience. We learned in order to be successful in life, we like to monitor and modify our behavior. This is the most important guardrail because this guardrail is about to guard your heart. Some of us have enjoyed this series, and others of us don't think guardrails are for us. We like the concept of it, the teaching of it, and the ideas of it, but we may not think it's for us. The biggest pushback to establishing guardrails is they keep me from something I want and they get in my way. So here's the thing. If you've decided, forget guardrails, you need to know that the tension will never go away. It's like leasing a car. You owning a car you can't afford doesn't remove the tension of you having to pay for it. If you're still not convinced that guardrails are for you, the other thing that doesn't go away is the temptation. You see, refusing to have guardrails does not erase the tension or the temptation that's going to come in your life. All it does is erode your resolve. The further you are on things, the easier it is for you to say yes, and the more difficult it'll become to say no. Your appetite is never fully satisfied. You feed an appetite and it grows. You never purchase a car to end all future purchases for that car. So let me ask you, what's your appetite? In finances, in relationships, at the workplace, at home, and so on. You see, I love Chips Ahoy chocolate chip cookies. You know, the soft kind that come in a red bag. What makes matters worse is that there is a convenience store located literally half a mile from my house. Therefore, Chips Ahoy cookies are always available. My appetite and desire is never fully satisfied. You see, I can smash a whole row of them chocolate chip cookies in less than 60 seconds. You don't believe me? I double dare you. Buy me a bag the next time you see me. I'm gonna prove it to you. You see, it's extremely difficult to say no because saying yes tastes just so good. However, when I lean into wisdom, I've had to make adjustments to my own chocolate chip cookie consumption. I basically have to draw an invisible line where my appetite for this sweet treat is manageable and I protect myself from a number of health-related issues. I don't want to deceive myself into thinking that I can eat all the chocolate chip cookies I want every night without it having a negative impact on my health. You see, the further back you stay away from certain invisible lines, remember those guardrails we talked about, the easier it is to resist your tension and overcome your temptation. It's fascinating that we see in Scripture someone that had a food guardrail as well. He was able to resist the temptation to consume the king's food. If you're familiar with the story of Daniel, we learn in Daniel chapter 1, verse 5, that the king was using something as subtle as food in an attempt to get him and his friends to compromise a relationship with God. Daniel, along with his 3 friends, were held captive in Babylon and selected to undergo a 3-year process of being indoctrinated and reoriented into the Babylonian culture before they entered into the king's service. Now, Daniel could have easily justified a decision to eat the king's food. After all, he is a captive, and refusing to eat the king's food could cost him his very life. It could also be viewed as disrespectful and dishonoring to the king. Daniel, however, realized consuming the king's food would be an attempt to slowly and completely eliminate his theological beliefs and values. What Daniel recognized was compromise does not erase the tension. It only weakens the resolve. Daniel realized that one day he'd abandon everything that he holds near and dear to his heart. So Daniel decided early in his captivity that he would not defile himself with the royal food and wine. He even asked permission to be excused from eating the food. We see later on in verse 8 that he resolved not to defile himself with anything that the king offered. You see, you have to keep in mind, for Daniel not to eat the food was disrespectful to the king and their culture. But he made up in his mind before he even knew this story ended, he was going to say no, and that by saying no, he could possibly lose his life. Like you and me, he knew where this was headed. But Daniel made the decision because he could predict the end of his story even before it began. In verse 9, it says, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. Here's the part Daniel factored in. He factored in the "and God" part. God will use your guardrail not just to protect you and direct you, but also to give you crazy favor with the very people who may be trying to keep you down. The biggest part is that Daniel's decision to draw a line in the sand was the thing God used to direct his entire life. If he didn't make this decision, we wouldn't have this story, and there may be a missing book from the Bible called Daniel. You see, you have no idea what hangs in the balance of your decision to establish guardrails in your life. You think you do, but you don't. As Daniel's stories continue in verse 17, he reveals that God gave him and 3 other men learning and skills in all literature and wisdom. This eventually led to Daniel having understanding in all visions and dreams. In fact, the scripture reveals that Daniel and the men were 10 times better than all the other personnel and people of authority when it came to the matters of wisdom and understanding. The king couldn't find anyone else in the entire kingdom who was able to do what these men were able to do. The result of what took place all started with Daniel's decision to not eat the king's food, which was a guardrail. God used this guardrail that Daniel implemented to protect and direct him. You see, Daniel's decision to use a guardrail in his life set up a defining moment. His decision is very similar to our own lives, where God will often show up in moments of temptation and trials. In moments of tension, when we decide, this is where I draw an invisible line, this is as far as I will go. I find it so interesting that in my own life, how having that guardrail in place not only protected me, but I believe it also allowed God to direct me. You see, Daniel had no idea that his decision would have such an impact, not only on him, but others as well. That's what happens when you make a simple decision to say, that's as far as I'll go. You see, I fully believe that God shows up when we do the practical. Why? Because he does the spiritual. Just like Daniel, you have no idea what hangs in the balance of your decision to establish guardrails for your life. At some point, as you predict your own future, it really comes down to if you're going to make up your mind. Are you going to ignore the need for guardrails? It will not remove the tension. All it does is just further the invisible line that you refuse to make. You see, culture will not help you. Culture will bait you to do what you want to do, however you want to do it. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 3 states, "The integrity of the upright guides them." If you implemented guardrails in your life, imagine what God could do in you and through you. Imagine what God could do in your career if you implemented guardrails. what he could do in your finances if you implemented guardrails, what he could do in your marriage or your singleness and all of your relationships if you simply implement a guardrail. Consider the possibility that you may be one decision away from implementing a guardrail that could potentially change the direction of your entire life. Learn from Daniel's story. Think for a second about your greatest regret. What could have been prevented or avoided if you had established a guardrail? Avoid future regrets, make up your mind, and know that God will use that ethical, moral decision to possibly direct your entire life. Realize that your tensions and temptations will not go away. In addition, eliminating or ignoring guardrails will bring you to a place where consequences are much worse. Not having guardrails will ensure that you will move closer to disaster. As you make the decision to implement a guardrail, you will always have to update those guardrails. Practically, I would suggest reviewing your guardrails every 3 to 6 months. Why? Because there will always be temptations and tensions that we have to manage. Also, you're going to grow. What may have worked for you then might not work for you now. And that's okay. Remember, the goal is for you to recognize your need for it so that you may implement it. The only thing that goes away without guardrails is your resolve. So my prayer for you is that you will make up your mind and decide to do this. I hope this series was encouraging to you and that you take that bold next step in implementing guardrails so that you can grow in your walk with Christ.